On the 13th of January 2012, passengers on board the luxury cruise ship, the Costa Concordia, were dismayed to feel a violent shudder run through the vessel. Glasses fell. Plates tumbled to the floor. Waiters stumbled. A moment later, the lights went out and then slowly came back on again. Something was wrong. Many passengers were sure of it. All the more so when they felt a slight tilt to the deck beneath their feet. But continuous loudspeaker announcements insisted that it was simply a power failure, a minor incident. This would later turn out not only to be untrue, but to be a deliberate lie. The Costa Concordia was completed in 2005 in an Italian shipyard and entered service a year later with Costa Cruises. At that time, it was the largest cruise ship in Italy, 290 meters or 951 feet long, with 17 decks and space for up to 4,880 passengers and crew. The interior, at least on the 13 decks that were open to the public, was decadent and luxurious. There were 1,500 cabins across several decks, along with 13 different bars, 6 restaurants, a theatre that spanned 3 decks, and a spa that spanned 2. There was also a casino, a disco, multiple lounges, an internet cafe, and a grand central atrium that cut through 9 decks. This truly impressive ship was launched with much ceremony in 2006, although when, as per tradition, a bottle of champagne was smashed against the hull, it failed to break. This was something that some sailors would typically regard as a grave ill omen. Despite this, the ship avoided any major problems during its first few years of service. It sustained some damage after colliding with a dock in 2008, but was soon repaired and back to its usual work of carrying passengers on luxury cruises around the Mediterranean. On the 13th of January 2012, the Costa Concordia was on the second day of one such cruise. It departed from the Italian port of Civitavecchia, close to Rome. Around 3,200 passengers, many of whom had just boarded that day, were joined by around 1,000 crew for a 7-day circular cruise. At the helm was 52-year-old Captain Francesco Schettino, a man who had started with Costa Cruises in 2002 as a safety officer and worked his way up to the role of captain. The 13th for Captain Schettino began peacefully enough. He went to dinner with his companion Domenica Samortan, a 25-year-old dancer with whom he was having an extramarital affair. After dining, the pair went up to the bridge, where Schettino would oversee a sail-by salute. Such salutes were commonplace on Costa Cruises and usually involved steering the ship close to land to provide a dramatic display both for passengers and for people on shore. On this day, however, a miscommunication took place between Captain Schettino and the helmsman, a miscommunication exacerbated by a language barrier between them. This caused the ship to be steered far closer to the island of Giglio than it should have been. Captain Schettino, who was navigating by sight and may also have been distracted by a phone call at the time, did not at first notice the error. When he did realize just how close to the rocky island shore they had strayed, he ordered a last-minute turn, but it was far too late. The Costa Concordia hit a rock which ripped a jagged hole in her side, penetrating 5 watertight compartments. At 9:42 p.m, passengers felt a violent shudder and heard a screeching groan. Some survivors would later liken it to an earthquake. People stumbled and fell, chairs and tables toppled. In the dining room, the song My Heart Will Go On by Celine Dion, best known for its inclusion in the soundtrack to the film Titanic, happened to be playing as waiters dropped trays and plates cascaded onto the floor. Lights throughout the ship went out, plunging passengers into darkness for almost a minute until the emergency power supply came online and lighting was restored. Though emergency generators could power lights and critical systems on board the ship, flooded engine compartments meant that the Costa Concordia could no longer be steered. She drifted, completing a 180-degree turn and moving slowly back towards shore. She would soon ground herself on rocks not far from those that had ripped a hole in her hull. As the ship drifted, the Italian Coast Guard started receiving calls from panicked passengers. One of the first calls came third-hand. A passenger had called a family member, who had called the police, who had called the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard made direct contact with the Costa Concordia, but were told that the ship was only experiencing a power failure, that there was no emergency, and that all that was needed was a single tugboat to get them back to port. This was untrue. On the bridge, Captain Schettino was aware that water was flooding into the ship, but was also in denial over what had happened, and desperate not to cause a panic. Hoping that the situation might still be salvageable, he made a deliberate decision to delay informing the Coast Guard and delay the evacuation of the ship. Because of this, it was 10:46 p.m., more than an hour after the collision, before a concerted Coast Guard response began. Meanwhile, on board the Costa Concordia, the ship's list was becoming more and more severe. Passengers were confused about where to go. Many had boarded just that morning, and there had not yet been a lifeboat drill. Even those who found their way to their muster stations were told firmly and repeatedly to return to their cabins and put away life jackets. It was only a power failure, they were told. But it was not only a power failure. The ship was sinking. Finally, at just before 11 p.m., the Costa Concordia had run aground. At this point, after much deliberation, the order was given to abandon ship. But this was no simple task. The severe list of the ship meant that any lifeboats on one side of the ship were unusable. There were scenes of panic as passengers fought for places on the lifeboats that remained. In places, calls were made to prioritize women and children, an old seafaring custom. However, this only caused more confusion among passengers, as it resulted in the separation of groups. Elsewhere, crew loaded lifeboats only to find that they didn't know how to safely lower them. They were forced simply to unload them again. Fearing that the unstable ship might roll all the way over, many jumped into the water and swam to shore. The list of the ship caused others to fall, leaving them no choice but to swim. 71-year-old Francis Servel and his wife, 61-year-old Nicole, had one life jacket between them. Francis insisted that his wife take it, as she could not swim. The pair jumped into the water. Nicole made it to the nearby rocks. Francis did not, and passed away in the water. Lifeboats were so few in number that those in use were ferrying passengers to shore and then returning to the wreck to pick up more survivors. Some rescuers used these returning boats to ride out to the stranded ship. In this fashion, Giglio's deputy mayor, Mario Pellegrini, boarded the Costa Concordia. He located crew members, who told him that nobody was in charge. With no other resort, Mario began assisting with the evacuation himself. At midnight, the ship shifted on the rocks, tilting dramatically onto its side. Many people fell. Decks became treacherous slides. Corridors became vertical shafts. Water flooded in as half the ship was submerged, rushing through rooms and corridors. When helicopters began arriving on scene soon thereafter, it was to see hundreds of people gathered on the side of the overturned ship, converging on a single tenuous rope ladder laid over the hull. This, for many of those left stranded on board, was the only safe way down to the numerous boats now waiting to rescue them. Slowly, painstakingly, survivors made their way down the ladder, or were plucked from the hull by helicopters. They were ferried to land, where they were quickly accommodated in hotels and in the homes of local residents. Mario Pellegrini, Giglio's deputy mayor who had travelled out to the wreck voluntarily, helped rescue several people trapped in a partially flooded corridor that had become a vertical shaft. He then coordinated the crowd around the single rope ladder leading down to the water. Hundreds of people used this ladder to evacuate, and though the hull of the ship was cold and slippery with spilled fuel, nobody fell during the entire operation. Mario Pellegrini and a doctor he had been working with were among the last to leave the ship of their own accord. They were ferried to land and went directly to a bar for a much-needed drink. One person notable for his absence throughout this time was Captain Schettino. He was eventually found on the rocks on the shore of Giglio, watching the rescue operation from a distance. He explained that when the ship rolled over, he had been thrown onto the roof of a lifeboat and had thus come to shore to coordinate the rescue from there. Captain Schettino was called by the Coast Guard and asked, then ordered to return to the ship. He vacillated, saying that it was too dark to see what was happening. Despite vigorous encouragement from a naval officer with the Coast Guard, Captain Schettino did not return to the ship. He ultimately took a taxi to a nearby hotel, asking the driver only where he could purchase new socks, as the ones he was wearing were wet. Even after the immediate rescue was over, the search continued. Some survivors were found long after the situation seemed hopeless. A newlywed couple were found safe in their stateroom. They had slept through the disaster and then awoken to find their door jammed. They were rescued, cold but uninjured. The last to be rescued was 57-year-old hotel director Manrico Giampadroni. He had stayed on the ship after it overturned in order to assist passengers, but had then fallen through a doorway into a partially flooded restaurant, breaking his leg in the process. After hauling himself onto a section of wall above the water, he sustained himself by drinking a bottle of cognac, and was eventually located and rescued a full day after the sinking. He was the last to be found alive. In total, 32 people had died. Many had drowned after becoming trapped when the ship turned over. Others had succumbed to hypothermia, or died after falling or jumping into the water. Some of the dead had been trapped in elevators, and others had returned to their cabins during the sinking to retrieve valuable possessions or vital medications, then become trapped there. In the course of the search, many holes were cut into the wreckage to allow divers to access different areas of the overturned ship. The wreck lay so close to the coast of Giglio that it presented an unwelcome spectacle for the island's residents. Over the many months it lay there, it was the subject of much protest. It obstructed shipping, was a constant reminder of a terrible tragedy, and also attracted looters who travelled out to the ship to strip it of whatever valuables they could find. Eventually, the Costa Concordia was righted using massive ballast tanks and a specially built metal structure. It was towed, broken down, and scrapped. Surviving passengers were offered compensation equivalent to around $14,000 by the cruise line, and many had to pursue civil suits against the company in order to be awarded more. Ultimately, it was decided that the company had no criminal responsibility for what had happened. Several individuals were charged and convicted of crimes including negligence. By far the most blame was placed on Captain Schettino. Although many other crew had been present, in many cases the final decision had ultimately been his. To perform the sail by salute, to delay the evacuation, to not inform the Coast Guard, to leave the ship prematurely, to fail to return when challenged. He was sentenced to 16 years in jail, and his career as a captain was over. He had intended to dazzle islanders with an unusually close salute, but instead had left them with one of the largest shipwrecks in the world.